Hey, everybody. Welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Berger.
And today we'll be exploring the case of the treasonous dolls. It's a World War II era true tale that features espionage, cryptic letters postmarked from Seattle, and a New York City doll shop that served as a front for covert communications with Japanese officials.
The United States declared war today on Japan.
If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It's got footage and photographs from the time and creepy dolls galore. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's break some code. I love a good spy novel. I don't know about you, Canute, but if I'm on a plane, for instance, I have to have a spy novel or some kind of a page-turner like that. I just can't go for any kind of fiction, no matter if it's won the Pulitzer Prize. I love a page-turner. I love spy novels, and I love spy movies.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. My father, I think I got it from him, partly because his bedside table was always full of, James Bond, John le Carré. And I began, taking those. But he was really interested in it. And at one time he actually was working on a novel about some spying in the Northwest during World War II. It didn't go very far, very well. And I've never been able to find the manuscript to it. But I remember he was working on that. But also during World War II, he was asked to spy on his base commander in California. He was in the Army Air Force. And apparently—
Asked by whom?
Asked by Army intelligence to spy on the base commander, who apparently was having government and military engineers build a road up to a very fancy home he had built on a mesa. And they were very interested in this guy and asked my dad to, keep his eyes open. He was a doctor. He was a captain. And my dad did. And this guy was eventually caught and went to jail, apparently.
It would be great if you could find that manuscript and then finish it.
Yeah, there you go.
Years before the United States entered World War I, the war came to the U.S.
Well, this isn't the first time that Mossback has covered espionage. I love the story that we did about German espionage in Seattle and the Puget Sound area, or on the West Coast, actually, before World War I, where they actually blew up a barge full of TNT in the middle of Elliott Bay.
And one night, the sound of that explosive campaign was loudly heard across Puget Sound.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, just because we weren't in the war yet the Germans were here trying to disrupt this materiel being sent through Seattle to Russia. Russia was an ally at that point in World War I. I also did a series for us, a written series, about a SS intelligence officer who visited Seattle in the late 1930s, 1938, was wined and dined by members of the German community here. He was a lawyer, and he told people, I'm here on vacation. I'm on my way to Alaska to go hunting. Well, he was in fact sent here under orders from Heinrich Himmler to gather intelligence in North America. He spent a year doing that, and I was able to find a copy of his reports.
How did you come across the case of the treasonous dolls? First of all, treasonous dolls sounds like a British band from the 80s, but it is, from the very beginning, completely intriguing.
Yeah.
Right away.
I can't actually remember. I was probably reading about World War II espionage, and I came across this intriguing name, a woman named Velvalee Dickinson.
Yes, who is Velvalee?
Well, who was Velvalee? And first of all, the name is just like, is that really a name? I never heard of the name Velvalee before. So I read that she was a woman accused of spying for Japan during World War II, and that she was owned a doll shop in New York City. And the more I read about her, I realized there was a strong Northwest connection because some of the spying she was alleged to have done took place on the West Coast. And so there was a Seattle connection, there was a Portland connection, and that got me really intrigued because as much as I read about her, the Northwest connection was not front and center. It was this more national story. And it is a significant national story from the war that isn't widely known.
But Velvalee was from the West Coast?
Yeah, she lived in San Francisco. She went to Stanford. And she and her husband lived in San Francisco for a time. And her sideline was as a dealer in exotic dolls, foreign dolls, dolls of different kinds, mainly selling them to collectors. She and her husband ended up moving to New York, and they opened a doll shop in a very pricey part of town. And, it was a high-end enterprise. And she would travel around the country meeting customers, buying and selling exotic dolls, and which is, an interesting profession. And when she lived in San Francisco, she had developed some connections with the Japanese community there, the diplomatic circles. She loved Japanese culture. She learned the tea ceremony. She was a Japanophile. And so in the years right before Pearl Harbor, an arrangement was made with Japanese diplomats in Washington, D.C. to be a connection for them.
What kind of connection? What would she do in New York City?
So she was paid a sizable sum of money to gather intelligence, and they were particularly interested in what was happening in naval shipyards on the West Coast. And she went down to Washington, D.C., and she was given $15,000 or more in cash, which was a lot of money in 1941, and was asked to provide information. Of course, this didn't come out until after she was caught.
So this was before Pearl Harbor happened. This is before America's entrance into the war.
It's right before Pearl Harbor. And of course, the West Coast shipyards they were interested in, as it turned out, were the ones repairing vessels that were damaged at Pearl Harbor. So in other words, you're talking about Bremerton, you're talking about Mare Island in California. They were interested, the information that she was said to provide was information on what ships were there and what kinds of repairs they were undergoing.
So they approached her before Pearl Harbor. Obviously, the plan had been set in motion, and they wanted to know what was going to happen to the ships that they were going to bomb.
Right. And her contacts included the Japanese naval attaché. In fact, later when she was caught and they found the money, they were able to trace that money to the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C.
The Japanese have attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and our defense facilities at Manila, capital of the Philippines.
So how did she do this? The whole thing sounds so improbable in a way to approach a doll collector, someone who sells dolls to spy for the Japanese Navy. How was this done? Why did they choose her?
Well, I think they chose her because she had these connections. She had a deep affinity for Japanese culture. She was smart. She was, an intelligent woman. And I'm sure that her husband was involved in some way. He must have known what was going on.
Did he have a profession?
He was in business, and it's kind of vague. He was older than she was. They seem to have owned some properties in San Francisco and also in the Seattle area. So they had reason to travel. that was part of kind of a cover for them when they were asked, or when she was asked, well, why were you going around the country? This is in the era of gas rationing, and here she and her husband are driving across the country, and they're driving from town to town, and this kind of thing. And this was something that raised suspicion on the part of the authorities when they caught on to there being something odd here. Her husband died actually fairly early on, so she was pursuing this basically on her own, although she tried to blame him for everything.
What was the method of contact? So how did this happen?
Yeah, so here's how the weird part about how it unraveled. So the method of communicating was writing messages and doing it under the name of various customers of hers. And she would describe dolls that she had found, or dolls that to be acquired, or these descriptions of the dolls. And then they were mailed to an address in Argentina. And one of them, the letter from Seattle, it had been postmarked in Seattle. And the return address wasn't her return address. The return address was one of her customers. So it looked like a very innocent kind of thing. Somebody, had sent a letter about dolls to Argentina. What's the big deal? Well, the censors at the post office were checking everything, and they read this letter, and then they got another one and another one. They began intercepting a series of these over the months.
And they were all sent to Buenos Aires?
They were all sent to Argentina, and returned as undeliverable.
The objective of military censorship is to prevent the inadvertent or willful disclosure of information which would harm the United States and her allies.
Describe the censorship laws. What did they prohibit, and how would they have applied to some letters about dolls?
Well, I think I know the reason they existed, the censorship laws existed, because they didn't want people sharing secrets or sharing information that would be valuable to any enemy intelligence service. And, that's a pretty broad subject. Soldiers often couldn't say where they were going. They couldn't say what base they were on. I know I went through, letters from World War II era that, and they would open the letters, they would read the letters. There were thousands of people working for the government doing this. And then they would reseal with a thing passed by censor,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it was a way to control the flow of information. And, I think they were fairly strict about it.
It is necessary to invade the privacy of your mail during wartime in search of contraband information.
It was the censors who noticed that there was something funky about these letters, the fact that they were getting multiple letters to a place in Argentina, that they were being all returned, that they read weird, and that caused the FBI to look into it. And, of course, then they're finding out, well, the people who wrote these letters didn't write these letters, and someone else did. And these coded messages don't make sense.
And the Buenos Aires address probably raised a few eyebrows.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And I mean, it was well known that both the Germans and Japanese had contacts, diplomatic and military contacts in other parts of America, including Latin America, including Mexico. And there was a lot of activity. I mean, there were sea battles off of the South America and whatnot, but they knew the intelligence network was pretty extensive. And, of course, what Velvalee apparently didn't know was that her contact in Argentina had fled or been compromised in some way, and so the letter drop was no good. If not for that, the information would have gotten into the hands of the Japanese Navy. As it was, they ended up being flagged and intercepted by the censors who began reading these. So when they began investigating and the FBI got involved, they found that the people who had supposedly written the letters had not written the letters. They didn't know anything about them.
But they were real people.
They were real people, and they were all customers of Velvalee.
Oh.
And so this began the sort of unraveling where they began investigating her. They began investigating her travels. They were able to determine that some of the letters had been written on typewriters in hotels that she had stayed in. They began to kind of draw these pieces together. And of course, the question was, the content was very unusual.
Yeah. Well, what did she say in these letters?
Well, in these letters, she would describe dolls, and let me see if I can find an example here. And the letters were addressed to a woman in Argentina, and this person was supposedly a doll collector, and it was a message between doll collectors. And so here was one that came from Seattle. It said, "The only 3 dolls I have are 3 lovely Irish dolls. One of these dolls is an old fisherman with a net over his back. Another is an old woman with wood on her back, and a third is a little boy." Here's another one. "I just secured a lovely Siamese temple dancer. It had been damaged, that is, tore in the middle, but it is now repaired, and I like it very much. I could not get a mate for his Siam dancer, so I am redressing just a small, plain, ordinary doll into a second Siam doll." So these are very cryptic messages. And so the FBI and the prosecutors turned to a woman who was America's first and foremost cryptanalyst, codebreaker, basically.
So this was some sort of code that the codebreaker was able to make sense of and decipher about ships that were being repaired after Pearl Harbor?
Yes. So the codebreaker, Elizabeth Smith Friedman, she was very experienced at code breaking. She and her husband were both cryptanalysts. She had been working, since before World War I. She and her husband had worked for a guy, a wealthy millionaire, who was attempting to prove that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays and that had done so in code. And so they were having them decipher his correspondence and whatnot in order to prove that he was actually Shakespeare. And so they met.
Magnificent obsession by a millionaire.
Yeah, exactly. But World War I came along, and they began to work on breaking codes. And of course, here you have a lot of radio transmissions going on, and it's kind of the early days of cryptoanalysis. There was a certain amount of that, like during the Civil War, but then it had kind of gone flat. Now it was reviving. So she did work for the U.S. Navy, breaking radio codes. She then worked for the Coast Guard during Prohibition. And the Coast Guard had developed a very sophisticated network for intercepting transmissions. And so Elizabeth Friedman became very good at deciphering all kinds of codes, including codes where you're using word substitutions, where bootleggers might be talking by radio and, referring to booze as some kind of other product or package or that kind of thing. So she sort of sharpened her teeth doing that. She played a key role in busting one of Al Capone's smuggling rings. And it turned out she also had a connection to the Northwest in that in her code breaking during the Prohibition era, she brought a lot of her code analysis to the West Coast to try and break bootlegger codes on the West Coast as well as on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And she also was brought into a trial in Vancouver, BC, that was a guns and opium smuggling ring run by Chinese, and they were getting opium and then sending guns to China. She was called to testify in that case, in which she broke a code in Mandarin. So, she was used to dealing with pretty complicated things. Yes. And when she looked at this and was asked, what do you think this is? She called it jargon code. And essentially she's saying, what's going on here is these dolls are actually ships that are in these shipyards. And they began to correlate some of these to known vessels that were in Bremerton or at Mare Island or at Portland or whatever that were under repair. And of course, this was very important not to let this information get out because the Japanese, military had done huge damage at Pearl Harbor, but they weren't sure how much damage they had done. And what they didn't know was how quickly the ships could be repaired.
I see.
And turned around. And of course, that was very key to the war in the Pacific was many of those ships were salvaged, repaired, and turned around in West Coast shipyards and then available for the war in the Pacific.
So when she's writing, Velvalee is writing about a Irish doll, a fisherman with a net on its back. Was that a reference to a specific kind of ship and a specific repair?
Right. The wood on its back was probably an aircraft carrier that was being converted. The netting probably referred to anti-submarine netting. The small doll might have been a destroyer of some kind. But they were able to kind of correlate these to ships that were under repair. And so they realized, this is not just gobbledygook. Somebody is, gathering this information. And so the focus centered on Velvalee Dickinson.
Who were her sources? Did she go to shipyards and get out the binocs and figure that out? Or how did she gather her information?
She eventually basically confessed. And she said that her sources were just people who lived near the shipyards. Might be shipyard workers, might be people who had a view of the Bremerton docks. And she was able to pick up a lot of what would have been very valuable information. Yeah, to me, it's like the loose lips sink ships. That was a common slogan and poster during the war, warning people if you work at a factory or a shipyard, don't talk about it. She was able to get people to talk, just chat. And, who would suspect her? So that seems to be the basis for a lot of the intelligence that she gathered.
So what happened to Velvalee?
Well, she was arrested. She was actually arrested at her bank. And she went to her bank to get stuff out of her safety deposit box. And in that safety deposit box, there was some $13,000 in cash that they were able to trace back to the Japanese embassy. She resisted arrest. I guess she fought with the FBI agents. They corralled her. And she was charged initially with having violated the censorship law, but they added treason to it because they were pretty sure that, who she was working for and what she was attempting to do. They really couldn't prove the treason charge because the letters had never been delivered.
I see.
They'd gone all the way to Argentina and got stamped and sent back. So it was just kind of a fluke that somebody caught somebody's eye and they began getting multiple letters and seeing that this was part of a pattern and that they were deceptive. Then once they knew what the code was and figured out what that was probably referring to, they ended up dropping the espionage charges. But in exchange, they told her, you got to tell us what you did and how you did it. And so that's why we know kind of what she admitted, I got the money, I did this, it was all my husband's doing, but she was the one that carried it out.
What was her ultimate sentence? So
she was given the maximum sentence of 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. And the judge, when she was sentenced, the judge wasn't fully satisfied that she was being punished enough. And he was shocked at, he says, any help given to the enemy means the death of American boys who are fighting for our national security. You, as a natural-born American citizen, having a university education and selling out to the Japanese were certainly engaged in espionage. So the court believed, yes, you were a spy. You weren't just duped into this by your husband. You benefited from it, and you knew exactly what you were doing. But she got 10 years sentence is pretty stiff. But she wasn't executed as for spying.
Do we know what happened to her after that?
She remained in prison for quite some time and was in a women's prison, but eventually was released and just kind of went back into obscurity.
Do you know what happened to the doll shop or any of the dolls?
I don't, And I think, the title of the thing, The Case of the Treasonous Dolls, we're sort of blaming the dolls who are not at fault here, right?
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Because there's something creepy about dolls sometimes.
And she was not convicted of treason, which she would have been if any of those letters had successfully gotten to whoever the agent was in Latin America. And it's interesting to note that the two women involved, Elizabeth Smith Friedman and Velvalee Dickinson, that this was kind of happening in South America. And one of the things that Friedman, one of her charges during World War II was decoding messages between Nazi contacts in South America and the American group at the Coast Guard that was working on that, decoding that. They had 3 Enigma machines, and they were able to break them and bring down the SS officer who was in charge of that whole operation. And it was this big, great embarrassment to some of the countries in Latin America that were, friendly to the Nazis and suddenly became very neutral as a result. So it's interesting that her work helped to break the network that Velvalee was funneling these messages to without realizing that her network had been broken and these things were just going back to the dead letter office.
But did Smith Friedman have something to do with the breaking of the Enigma code?
Yes, her unit and her husband also was working on Enigma. And he traveled to Bletchley Park. The Americans and British were sharing information. And the British, of course, were focused on the North Atlantic and the areas and the Mediterranean areas that were affecting them in the war. The Americans were focusing on the Atlantic coast of North and South America. And so they were working on the same machines, but the machines were coded differently. And so when they would break a code or break part of a code, they would share information back and forth. So the Enigma story goes beyond Bletchley Park, but actually comes back to this country as well, that's a story I don't know much about, but I'm fascinated by that connection.
Well, this story is fascinating because of the parallel tracks of these two women who have very different lives and obviously are engaged in 2 very different pursuits. I see a movie here.
Yeah. The judge was not sympathetic to Velvalee and basically said, you're a college graduate. You're an American, natural-born American citizen. How could you do this? I think you're a traitor,
Well, isn't it unsettling and unsettlingly ironic that at the time that we're putting Japanese and Japanese Americans in concentration camps for fear of them spying, and then we have this white lady from New York who is spying for the Japanese.
Who is doing it and getting away with it.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I know. It's crazy.
When you think about it, there were all sorts of things happening in the Puget Sound area that were of importance.
Huge Boeing plants out of tough metal, they forge America's fighting bomber.
We covered the Boeing camouflage story, the fake city put on top of the Boeing factory so it would be less detectable from the air.
Boeing was turning out nearly a third of the new planes used in the war. It had to be protected.
Shipyards, all sorts of things that were happening then and are still happening that other people, other countries, potential adversaries would want to know about. I remember a long time ago that the stories of Soviet submarines trying to sneak into Puget Sound to see how far they could go, all sorts of stuff are happening in this corner of the world.
Yeah, we think of Seattle back in the early 20th century as being kind of isolated, but we weren't really. I mean, we weren't on top of mind for people in New York, but when it came to security issues, you know, this hysteria that caused the internment of the Japanese Americans. You get 100,000 plus people put into these camps, sent into the middle of nowhere, away from the coast. This was destruction of rights in order to preserve security. These things are still with us in different forms today. That impulse is still there. And what's interesting to me, too, is the stuff that is mundane. Now, I mentioned that a SS officer and a SS companion came to Seattle in the late 1930s and was wined and dined by the low. They took him to Mount Rainier. They took him yachting on Lake Washington. And the kind of the way he went about it was meeting with the German-American community, going to cocktail parties, or having people invite him to cocktail parties with university professors, with lawyers, with movers and shakers, and assessing what do these people think about Germany? What do these people think about the war? What do they think about Jews? And he's basically trying to size up what is the sympathy of people here? What could we capitalize on? And these are things that you would just get over cocktails with businessmen, that kind of thing. And so there's this level on which espionage can be big and looking at exclusive military secrets and that kind of thing. And it can also be conversations with people who have an ulterior motive and are assessing the potential of an attack or a manipulation or of propaganda or whatever. All of that is insidious if it's against your people, your country, but it comes in these different forms.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 11th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. And now, if you prefer to watch your podcasts, you're in luck. Head to YouTube to see a brand new video version of the Mossback podcast. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Studio recording and setup by Rusty Bacall, Victoria Ralph, Roger Basquette, Lucy Barrera, Yamina Stiet, and Matt Brott. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, local news, and more. Plus, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.